I'm Batman.
Well, I hardly think so. The real Cape Crusader calls his crime-fighting cohorts when he's running late.
I had to walk. I couldn't get Raj on the back of my scooter.
I've said this before and I'll say it again. Aquaman sucks.
And good evening, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Geekend. We have another episode with you tonight, and we are going to be discussing something that really, I think, is a fascinating topic on a number of levels. It's the concept of an anti-hero and what really is the difference in a villain and a hero and an anti-hero, and delving into exactly what makes them tick, why they're interesting. And as a longtime comic book nerd, this is something that has really gone back and forth over the course of my lifetime in the comic book industry. Do they help comic books? Or are they kind of a blight on them? So we're going to be delving into all of that here. And for our panel tonight, we have Chris and Justin with us. Good evening, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
So I want to go ahead, and I think that it's very, very important. We all kind of talked about this beforehand of how crucial it is to really define our terms, because the concept of an anti-hero is not necessarily something that's set in stone. And so I wanted to go ahead and get your thoughts of what actually constitutes an anti-hero and how are they different from your villains and your heroes in comic books, in movies. We can use anime here if we want to. So really just the overarching concept of it.
I guess part of defining an anti-hero is part of just the word itself is contrasted against what a hero would be, right? So whatever your stereotypical hero would be, the anti-hero is defined as being a contrast to that. And that may seem kind of simple and not very helpful, but I think you got to start there, right? When you think about what a hero is, now you have to think of something that is in some way not that or opposed to that, but not in the way of a villain, right? Mm-hmm. But of someone who's not showing the characteristics that the hero shows. So I think part of those things would be cynicism, character flaws that play a significant role in their development, so not just something that's tacked on at the end, but something that actually presents a challenge for them to either overcome or not and remain an anti-hero. Sometimes you might have moral flaws or moral inconsistencies, that might go against what you would expect the hero's values to be. And then I think also you sometimes see behavioral traits. Maybe they're a loner, or maybe they're standoffish, or maybe they act out in some ways. I think all those can kind of signal someone who's an anti-hero as well. And I think when you combine those traits, basically you wind up with a protagonist that people would not pick if it was like a dodgeball line for their hero, but they're the person that has to do the hero thing.
So I think if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, one thing that would define an anti-hero for you is somebody that is an unexpected or an unintentional hero.
I think it's part of it. I don't think that's all of it, but I think it's part of it.
All right. What about you, Justin?
Well, yeah, just to tack on to that, like you said, unintentional or unexpected. Lots of times your anti-heroes are going to be somebody who's working for their own self-interest that happens to also be the greater good in that particular situation. Lots of times the anti-heroes phase back and forth between being morally irrelevant or being flat-out villains. And I think it really does boil down at its core to being they are virtuous in many ways, but have some sort of glaring deficiency, some sort of glaring flaw. Like, for instance, they may have a severe lack of mercy and see just judge, jury, and executioner as the role that they are to fill, or they'll have some sort of philosophical error, like maybe they'll be a nihilist and think that everything's meaningless, but they happen to like the person or the groups of persons or the town or whatever that they're saving.
No, I agree. And one thing that I would point to, because I think that we've got a pretty good handle on it, but I think that morality can't necessarily be the only indicator, because then you have to have the debate about the difference between actual morality and their personal morality. Because if you think about it, if you were to define it strictly by whether or not they adhere to a moral code, well, then Thanos could technically qualify. Because Thanos does have a moral code, and he does stick to it religiously, but I don't think that you could really make the argument that he's an anti-hero. Just because he believes what he is doing is right doesn't necessarily put him in that category.
Well, there has to be some sort of alignment between their perception of good and actual good.
Yeah, I think that that's at least a quality that needs to be explored.
Or the wider perception of good within the story that they live in, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they have to draw a contrast between their morality, or they don't have to, but they might often draw a contrast between whatever their morality is and the generally accepted morality around them.
Yeah, I think that actually one interesting character that we could bring up here as well is Deadpool. Because Deadpool doesn't really do anything because he believes it's virtuous. He kind of stumbles into doing the right thing most of the time. And there's some debate between fans as to whether or not sometimes it's just because he wants to keep up appearances, which I think is kind of a non-starter with Deadpool. But that he just wants to keep up the appearance of being cool, and that's why he doesn't, I guess, broadcast it to the world that he's doing this because he thinks it's the right thing to do. But he does seem to, an awful lot of the times, wind up on the right side, despite the fact that it just happens to somehow line up with his personal interest when he decides to do something. I think that you could make a similar argument for somebody like Wolverine. Like, Wolverine enjoys being a part of the X-Men, and he does have morals, and he does see himself as fighting for a greater good. But to go back to what you were both saying about having one major deficiency, Wolverine just basically has no remorse for anything. He just goes around killing people. And sometimes it's somebody that really deserves it. Sometimes it's almost more somebody that just got in his way. And that way may be because he thought it was the right thing to do. But, I mean, I think Wolverine's a really interesting example of an anti-hero as well. And so I think that you guys are absolutely on the right path. And I agree with virtually everything that you said. But I think that we can't specifically tie it only to somebody that sticks to their moral code. There does have to be, like Chris was alluding to, some connection between an objective good and their version of good for them to actually be considered an anti-hero.
And it seems like a common characteristic among anti-heroes is this is a very Socratic discussion. I like it. That when asked, do the ends justify the means, they will usually answer yes.
That's probably fair. Come to think of it, I'm very hard pressed right now to think of an example that counters that, of an anti-hero that doesn't think that the end justifies the means. And so maybe that's a pretty good gauge of whether or not they actually qualify as a hero or an anti-hero or a villain.
Or at least they can be persuaded that the ends justify the means.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you would absolutely say that the only people that don't believe that the end justifies the means are people that fall into the lawful good category.
The idealistic heroes.
And of course, there's no such thing as a lawful good anti-hero. So if they do have that, they're automatically out of the discussion. Like, nobody could make the argument that Spider-Man or Superman or Captain America are anti-heroes. And that's because they pretty squarely fit into that lawful good alliance. In my mind, what really makes a hero and what separates him from everybody else, what moves a good person from just a good guy into the realm of heroic, would be the ability and the willingness to self-sacrifice. I think that's really what makes the big difference. And so if we were to look at it from that angle, I think that what really constitutes an anti-hero is somebody that has a lot of the good qualities, and you might even be willing to qualify as a good guy, but doesn't necessarily have what we would call the heroic mark, the heroic qualities. And I think, part of that comes from my Christian worldview and the ultimate hero being Jesus Christ, who, of course, was willing to sacrifice everything in exchange for other people. But really, I do think that that's the mark of a hero. I think the reason that you look at your classic heroes, people like Spider-Man, like Superman, they are willing to give up of themselves in order to serve the greater good simply because it is the greater good. In my mind, that's what differentiates them from heroes that are typically thought of more as anti-heroes. I think that anti-heroes, they wind up attacking some of the same people and they wind up being on the side of the good guys very often, but they're really doing it more for self-interest than self-sacrifice. And I think that the best example of this is actually Iron Man. Even though I'm not a huge Iron Man fan, and I know that there's going to be people that just cut off the broadcast after hearing that, but I'm not nearly as big an Iron Man fan as a lot of people. But the interesting thing about Iron Man and his sort of journey across the Marvel Universe, I think that it's sort of summed up in something that Captain America says to him in the very first Avengers movie, because you may notice that Iron Man, I would classify him as an anti-hero all the way up until the first Avengers movie. Because you'll notice in the movies that precede that, in the original Iron Man, yes, he does take down the bad guys, and yes, he does save a lot of lives. But he gains a lot from it. He has a self-interest in keeping Obadiah Stane from stealing his ideas. He has a self-interest in all of those things. In Iron Man 2, even though, yes, he does save people, he saves Pepper Potts and somewhat selflessly goes in to protect her, but it's because he likes her and he wants her and she's a personal friend to him. He always has something to gain by doing that. And I know that we don't stereotypically think of even early Iron Man as an anti-hero, but I do. And I think the moment that really defines him and makes him take that leap from anti-hero to hero is in Avengers 1, where he decides to sacrifice his own life. You'll remember that earlier in that same movie, Captain America said, because he doesn't think of Iron Man as a hero either, he says, you're not the guy to make the sacrifice play. You're not the one to lay it all on the line. You're not going to be the one that lays down on a tripwire to let your buddies step over. And he's right. And I think Iron Man recognizes that, and that's the reason that you see his character evolution. And so if you really want to understand what I would think of as an anti-hero, I think that's a pretty darn good summary of it. That you have to have that element of self-sacrifice in order to be heroic. And if you're a person that just happens to be on the same side as the good guys, or a person that just winds up hurting bad people a lot, but you're doing it because of your own self-interest, you're doing it because that's what you want to do as opposed to it being the right thing to do, you probably fall more into the anti-hero camp. What would you say are the best examples of an anti-hero? We've already used several of them to kind of make our points, but if you could come up with a archetype of an anti-hero, who do you think would epitomize that and why?
For some reason, the Count of Monte Cristo came to mind as you were asking that question, but I'm not sure if we could quite call him an anti-hero, or would he be a villain? I don't know. It's kind of like we were discussing before we went on air. Jack Sparrow, right? It seems like he is primarily motivated by self-interest and doesn't really seem to care about it. It seems like it would be difficult to call him an anti-hero rather than just a sort of chaotic neutral kind of thing.
Right.
And the Count of Monte Cristo, I'm not sure if that would go along those lines. But we were saying earlier, Jason Todd as the Red Hood would definitely be a anti-hero archetype. And you think about what his motivations are. He sees Bruce Wayne, Batman's resistance to killing, as a flaw in Batman. Because look, all these opportunities he had to do away with Joker, and he just would not do it. And finally Joker does away with Jason Todd. Mm-hmm. And if Bruce had just ended Joker sooner, then he would never have to go through that pain. and this man is supposed to care about me. Why didn't he protect me? Why was he so attached to his idealism that he wouldn't kill Joker off, that he was willing to see me die instead? That kind of thing. So he decides, I'm going to be the hero that Batman's incapable of being, and I'm going to kill.
Yeah, I think those are a couple of really good examples. In fact, Red Hood was one of the very first ones that I thought of, but specifically because of that, because I think that one thing that is really a defining trait of the anti-hero is they just wind up hurting bad people. You know what I'm saying? Like, even if they're doing it for self-interest, what kind of moves somebody into that category is it seems like all the people that they choose to hurt tend to be, whether their methods are correct or not, it's always people that are worse than they are, I guess is the best way to say it.
So I think the one that most quickly comes to mind for me would be Han Solo, right? And he has some character development over the course of the Star Wars movies where he might shift a little back and forth. But when we see Han Solo in A New Hope, for example, he's in it for the money. He's in it for a reward. He'll do the right thing, but it needs to be worth his while to do it. He's not the one that's going to take up the mantle of hero, and yet he has his heroic moment at the end, right? So I think Han Solo is a good example. I'll give you one that you probably don't know. Harry Dresden from the Dresden Files. It's a fictional fantasy novel series, and Harry Dresden is a wizard detective in Chicago, and he works the beat as their supernatural detective. And as with a lot of different noir tropes, I think you get a lot of anti-heroes in that type of literature.
Those are typically devoid of heroes altogether, usually.
Right. So you got the guy in the long coat with the hat, the wide brim hat, and he's going down, he's punching monsters or whatever. But again, a flawed hero, but he's the one that's out there to save the day because really he's the only one who can. Here's one that I think is interesting, and I don't know if we want to get into a side discussion on it, but I've seen Sherlock Holmes brought up as an anti-hero, and I think he fits the role in several ways. He doesn't in most media. Sherlock Holmes is not presented as the idealistic hero. He's not presented as having a consistent archetypal moral code, and yet he does the right thing. He does good, right? He solves the cases because no one else can. But he's an opium addict. He's erratic. He's not tied to a higher moral standard. He's solving the crimes because he solves the crimes. So I think that's a really interesting one, actually. An interesting suggestion of Sherlock Holmes being an anti-hero.
I will say that I think Robert Downey Jr.'s version of Sherlock Holmes is much closer to an anti-hero than the more traditional interpretations of the character.
Right. And then also, we were talking about this one earlier, Guardians of the Galaxy. I think the MCU has a lot of anti-heroes, and that's kind of part of what makes them so likable. But I think Guardians of the Galaxy is a really good example of an entire team of anti-heroes. They have hearts of gold in a way. They wind up doing the right thing. They save the universe, but they do it on their terms, and there's usually a payoff.
Yeah, I will say, with their example, I think the funniest thing about that is that the one that has the most excuse to be the most evil is the one that I would almost question whether or not she is an anti-hero or not, and not just a hero, and that's Gamora. Like, Gamora is the moral compass of them, which is odd because she's also Thanos' daughter and has the most excuse. Like, she would be the most justifiably evil one, and yet she's the best one in the group.
Right. And oftentimes these characters are your crime fighters, the ones that get down into the dirt with the criminals, bounty hunters, detectives, those types.
Your street level guys.
Yeah. I mean, we could argue Batman, right?
Yeah.
But I think Batman is sometimes presented as an anti-hero, and I think it's the same reason, because they're the ones that are getting down in the dirt with the bad guys.
Yeah, I actually typically consider Batman to be a hero, and I think that I think that there's a decent argument to be made that he's an anti-hero, but I think because of, first of all, his rule of not killing, which he follows to a T to almost a fault, as we've actually already discussed, is one of the
Jason
things.
Todd would agree.
Well, yes, he definitely would. But I think that's actually what really keeps him from being an anti-hero. But as far as anti-heroes go, there's a couple of really interesting ones. And I wanted to give one on each side that is an anti-hero and teetering on the brink of being good, and another one that's teetering on the brink of being bad. And I'll start with the bad first. I think a fantastic anti-hero, one of the best ones in all of literature, is Sasuke Uchiha. And I think that's ultimately because he kind of bats back and forth, and the writer does this very well, to where you're not sure what his motivations are. Now, granted, he winds up hurting a lot of really terrible people, but you're always kind of wondering, okay, is he doing it because he does want to take them down and has some kind of, I don't know, altruistic backing behind that, or is he doing it because they hurt him personally? Because just about everybody that he winds up taking down, you could make an argument for either one. With, trying not to give away any spoilers here in case you haven't seen all 1,070 episodes of Naruto. But he winds up taking down an awful lot of people that just personally slighted him. And so you're never 100% sure if he's doing it for the sake of other people or he's doing it for himself. And I think that that's part of the reason that he could definitely be seen in the series as a villain, but he teeters on the brink of that because you're not really sure. Maybe he really does have a motivation that's bigger than himself. And when it comes to Sasuke's decision making in that, the writer gives just enough vagueness to make you wonder if it really is self-motivated or it really is because of familial love or concern about people that are still back in Konoha. And so I think that he's a good example of a anti-hero that's sort of right on that borderline between anti-hero and villain.
I've never watched Naruto, but the way you described him reminds me a lot of Kenpachi from Bleach. Just wants to go up against the ones that have slighted him. And actually, I don't know, because when Chris was talking about Sherlock Holmes, one thing that really stuck out as a trait that would make him qualify as an anti-hero is, at least the way he's depicted in the movies. It's been a long time since I've read any of the books, but his main motivation is he wants to win. He wants to intellectually best his opponent. And, Kenpachi, in the same way, he just wants to win.
Right, he just wants to physically beat somebody down. That's his motivation.
Exactly.
So no, that's actually a really good example. And I think that one that kind of, I would even put in the hero category, but I think his motivations one that falls into the anti-hero category, but is always sort of on the brink of being a hero character. And I think you could make an argument for her being just a straight hero, is another one from Star Wars, Ahsoka Tano. Because obviously she's a hero character in the beginning of the Clone Wars series. But the further on you go and the more that she winds up distancing herself from the Jedi, especially, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but the newest episodes in the Clone Wars series, the new season that just came out, she makes some very questionable decisions that would very much be more in the line of what a gray Jedi would do than an actual Jedi. And so I find that really interesting, that she's always trying to do the right thing, in the sense that her motivation throughout the entire series seems to be making sure the galaxy is safe, that people don't get hurt. And her motivations are always in the right place, but sometimes she tries to reach that goal through very questionable means. And again, I'm trying to avoid spoilers, especially since that's a very new one. But the fact that she makes some decisions where she lets some very bad things happen to people in order to try to get to the greater good, as it were, that's a very anti-hero quality as far as I see it as well.
Well, at that point in the Star Wars universe, Darth Vader himself is an anti-hero. And her master.
Could you say that he's an anti-hero, or would you say that Anakin goes from anti-hero to villain?
He does, yeah. That is what I'm saying.
You're not necessarily always an anti-hero. You can change roles.
Yeah.
And I agree. I thought Justin was saying that Darth Vader himself is an anti-hero. I would say before the transition, like before the fight to with Obi-Wan, he is an anti-hero, but when he makes that transition to Darth Vader, he's definitely in the villain category at
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah.
Do you think that anti-heroes define villains, or sorry, define their heroes as well as the villains do? Because one quality that we see all the time in heroes is that they're somewhat defined by their villains. For example, I think Batman is the best example of this because in a lot of ways, Batman's villains define who he is. Whether you're talking about Joker, Ra's al Ghul, Bane, it's almost like every Batman villain reflects some aspect of Batman in some way. And do you think that the anti-heroes do that in a similar fashion? Because I think I kind of go back and forth on this one. I think the villains tend to do a better job of it, but do you think that an anti-hero can do that just as well? Chris, we'll start with you.
So I think a villain helps define a hero by giving them purpose, right? Giving them a call and a quest, as it were. In a different way, I think the anti-hero helps define a hero by providing a foil. So if you have your young, maybe naive, hopeful Luke Skywalker, well, you complement that with a foil of a cynical, been around the block, rough around the edges Han Solo, right? They complement each other in that way, even though they have the same mission. Their outlook is very different, and it provides interesting story options or storylines to see them go back and forth and play with their perspectives. So I think whereas the villain provides the story itself often, or the plot when compared against the hero, I think the anti-hero serves to ask questions, maybe more of a side quest kind of thing, where the anti-hero lets you see parts of the hero that you maybe wouldn't have seen before because the anti-hero is there to play the foil. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm picking up what you're putting down. And one example that I was going to use, and I'll just say it now because I think it goes along with the point that you're making so well. One that jumped into my mind is Cyclops and Wolverine. Because sometimes Cyclops' most defining moments as a leader are not how he leads the team through adversity, but how he handles Wolverine. Just because Wolverine's so incredibly different than him, Cyclops is a lawful good, by the book kind of guy, and Wolverine's the exact opposite. He's like, let's just get it done. If we have to, do some questionable things along the way, I'm perfectly okay with that. Cyclops isn't. And so some of his best moments, at least defining him in the context of being a leader, I don't know if it's necessarily the same as being a hero, but as far as the leader of his team, some of his most challenging moments are not dealing with some kind of external adversity. It's how he deals internally with the dynamics of his team and holding everybody together, despite the fact he's got somebody like Wolverine on the team with him. And sort of trying to rein him in is something that I think is a very admirable quality in Scott. And frankly, I think that it's one of the reasons that even though they knock heads all the time, Wolverine respects him as much as he does. Justin, what were your thoughts on this one?
I think no. I don't think the purpose of the anti-hero is to define the hero. I think the purpose of the anti-hero is as an alternative to the hero. Whereas, classically in a heroic tale, you would have the good guy. And there's no question that he's the good guy. He is not meant to be somebody that you necessarily relate to. He's meant to be somebody that you aspire to. The archetype, the pinnacle of virtue, the pinnacle of goodness, and the villain serves as his obstacle, the embodiment of evil, basically. And you see that a lot in the golden age of comic books. You see that more clearly defined like that. But as we've become more, I guess I'd say cynical and questioning as a society, and even more relativistic, questioning the idea of an objective morality at all, the anti-hero has served more served as more of a relatable hero. He's still doing good, but like who's to say what the ultimate, pinnacle of goodness, the pinnacle of virtue, the ultimate ideal hero is supposed to be? Well, good is all relative and it's based off of societal norms. So, here we have the anti-hero. He does it more the way I would do it. If I had that kind of power, if I had that kind of ability. I think it's less about defining the heroes as characters and more of an alternative to the hero.
I get what you're saying. I'm not sure that I agree, but why would be, and I'll ask it this way. Why would being an alternative of the hero not define the hero? Because,
well, are we talking about on a general level, like defining what a hero is, or are we talking about within the stories?
Specifically within the story.
Well, so lots of anti-heroes don't really have a hero to serve as their counterpart. Like Sherlock Holmes, for instance.
Right, but I'm saying in one where they are there. So in a story where there is a hero and then there's also an anti-hero, why would being basically a different version or a darker version of the hero not help define the hero's character?
I suppose it could help define that specific, because like one of the general things we agreed on and what defines an anti-hero is they have some sort of, speaking as men who do believe in an objective good, right. They have some sort of failing in the objective good, the set of virtues. So in that sense, they can help define the hero by emphasizing what is the difference between having that virtue or not having that virtue, and what does that look like if you remove only one part of the equation rather than discarding with the entire equation. The original question was, does an anti-hero do as well
as a villain? Yeah,
I wouldn't say that it does as well. It's a different kind of defining.
It does. That's true.
I'm finding myself modifying my opinion as we speak, but yeah, it's a different kind of defining. I'll have to agree with Chris there.
Can I suggest something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I suggest that a hero and an anti-hero are both contextually dependent. So, for example, and unfortunately, I don't think you guys. I'm going back to the Dresden one because that's the one that just came to mind. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Harry Dresden in the Dresden Files is presented as the main character of the books. He's the protagonist. I would say he fits the mold of an anti-hero pretty easily, at least to start. I think he kind of develops more into a high fantasy idealistic hero toward the end there. But at one point later in the books, a character is introduced named Michael. And Michael is, I guess you could call him a knight. He's a white knight. He is a holy, divine white knight.
Like the angel.
And so, in the context of the Dresden Files, I think you could argue that Michael is the anti-hero. Not because he fits what you would stereotypically call an anti-hero, but because if Harry Dresden is the hero of the story, then the contrast against the main hero is the anti-hero. Does that make sense?
So,
for example, if
I'm following what you're saying, but at the same time, I'm a little bit confused because now we have to almost go back to the defining terms thing.
It's just ideas that are coming to my head. But let's say that Star Wars was a story about Han Solo instead of about Luke. If Han Solo was the protagonist for Star Wars, then you could say if Han's the hero, Luke is the anti-hero.
Well, wouldn't we then be discarding with the objective criteria?
Right, and another thing that presents a problem with is one example that I've already given. Like, there are anti-heroes that are anti-heroes without having a hero to play off of, like Deadpool. Like, Deadpool's in a series by himself. There are no heroes in his story. He's just an anti-hero not because of any one specific hero, but because he defies what is normally thought of as heroic.
Yeah, I think in those cases, the hero that they're the anti-hero to is the generic or the standard, the ideal, right? An undefined ideal hero. Not undefined, but an unnamed, I guess, ideal hero.
Your
Like,
stereotypical good guy.
yeah, so like Deadpool may not have a specific character that he's a foil to, or he's anti whatever they are. But
Except
since
in
you
the
know what
Deadpool and Spider-Man series, but yeah.
but since you know what a hero is, then you understand how he's an anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff around.
So perhaps we should avoid the risk of conflating protagonist and hero
Right.
as the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's possible.
That's
You can even have a villain protagonist, right?
The Joker.
Joker. Yeah. The Joker movie. We both thought of that immediately.
Just they Venom, but yeah.
Well, see, I don't know. I still haven't seen Venom, which I know is going to be a surprise to y'all because I see every comic book movie, but I don't know. Sony's just crapped on the Spider-Man series so many times. I had no faith that it was going to be good. So
they'll reboot it again.
Yeah, in the next couple of years, I'm sure they will. Here's my final question, because I think that this has a lot to do with just how we consume media and stories and narratives as a culture. And we've already spoken a little bit to this, but I think we can go a little bit more in depth. Have heroes become more like anti-heroes? Like, have we gotten to a point to where even heroes that we understood as to be classically good, because of the way that our society has changed in the past, I would say several decades, that we moved to a point to where virtually all of our heroes have become more like anti-heroes, even the ones that we would consider classically good?
All of our heroes or all of our protagonists?
All of our heroes.
Is that even possible? Like, I mean, we
I didn't say become
defining...
anti-heroes. I said become more like anti-heroes.
What do you mean?
So, like, the thing that I was rolling around in my head when I was coming up with this question is things like Superman.
Yep.
Superman has...
break 50 years ago?
Do what now?
Superman break someone's neck 50 years ago?
Of course not. But I'm not even necessarily talking about the movie version. Like, our heroes have gotten significantly darker, and I think that's safe to say. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. But has that movement towards darkness and making them more relatable, has that made them more into anti-heroes? Because I think there's a decent argument that it has. I wanted to get your reactions to that.
I'm having difficulty because, like, on a certain grounds, I want to say protagonist, because the way we defined anti-hero and contrasted it to hero, we determined that there's an objective model for a hero, so a hero cannot also be an anti-hero or really resemble an anti-hero, I would say. But we definitely do look more at the internal struggle to be a hero. There's definitely a lot more interest in that. Like, if only I could remember, I think it was in the Justice League series when Superman was fighting Darkseid, and he gave this whole monologue. He's like, you have no idea what it's like to always have to be careful, to always be afraid that you're going to just level a building or kill somebody by, blowing on them too hard. He's like, you offer me this rare opportunity to finally let loose. Yeah. And it's like, maybe that does resemble a little bit of an anti-hero, but it could be more revealing that internal struggle to be a hero that Superman is dealing with on a daily basis. So I guess maybe we could say the heroes reveal more of their potential to be anti-heroes, but I'm not sure we could say that they are becoming more like anti-heroes.
Okay, so real quick, that was the final episode of the Justice League Unlimited series, and it's one of the coolest moments in all of DC history, in my opinion.
Yes.
So excellent using that as a reference, but I can see where you're coming from on that And that was actually an angle I had not thought of, which is, the reason that I have you guys on here is because you bring different ideas to the table. That maybe what we could perceive as them being more anti-hero like, because you're right, classic Golden Age Superman would have never said something like that.
Right.
But he said that because he's showing that he has a righteous anger because of what Darkseid has done, and that sort of brought that out of him. So it seemed a little anti-hero-ish, but it could have been something that logically even Golden Age Superman felt and just never articulated.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
where he still acts the hero, but you see where his weaknesses lie, where he has that potential to not be a hero.
and Darkseid brings that out of Superman better than anybody. In fact, in that same series, in Justice League Unlimited, in an earlier episode when they faced off against Darkseid earlier, Superman actually said, when he was challenged, he says, this time I'm not going to stop until you're just a greasy spot on my fist. And I'm like, whoa, that is way dark for Superman.
Well, Darkseid's whole thing is knowing how people tick. His whole spiel is the anti-life equation. So
right, Chris, what do you think?
Darkseid is nihilism embodied.
It really is. I mean, he's like if you made nihilism into a character, it would definitely be Darkseid. Chris, what do you think about this?
So I think our modern incarnations of past heroes have probably started trending more towards anti-heroes as they've been more fleshed out. I think that reflects both social culture, shifts. But I think also one of the problems from a storytelling perspective, from my point of view at least, with an ideal hero is you run out of material. Whereas anti-heroes give you room to ask questions and to poke and prod and come up with themes or situations or questions or whatever it may be to explore. And from the perspective of someone who's trying to create content and sell it, obviously, that gives you more to work with, I think, when you start to run out of things that you can do to the ideal hero. So I think part of it's been a socio-cultural trend, and I think that's reflected in the authors and the artists and the writers and the directors. But I think also there's probably been a practical side to it that you can get more movies and more episodes and more books out of anti-heroes because you get more room to ask questions and to dive deeper into the character flaws or the situations that arise out of those flaws. So I think there has been a trend to where anti-heroes are now more prevalent than they used to be. But I do wonder if we may be on the far edge of that curve, and we might be moving into eventually another, maybe like a post anti-hero world. And I'm curious as to what that will look like, because anti-heroes are starting to get cliche, right? So what happens after that?
Well, I think that a perfect example of what you're talking about is the movie universe as it pertains to comic books, because we actually mentioned earlier Superman snapping somebody's neck, which is not something that comic book Superman would do, so that's already out of character for him. There was a tendency, especially among the DC movies, and I would say even among the early Marvel movies, to make every character Batman. And the reason they wanted to make every character Batman is because Batman was successful, so let's just do what they were doing with Batman. But the reason that Batman is interesting is because he's not like every other hero. Like, once you try to make every character into an anti-hero, the anti-heroes get boring because every character's just like them. And so having somebody that acts as a different take on the anti-hero, for example, the reason that the Dark Knight series by Frank Miller is so compelling is because instead of Batman fighting one of his stereotypical villains, he finds himself at odds with the Man of Steel. Like, that's fascinating. And I know that we've seen that a lot recently, but when Frank Miller did that, no one had really done that before. put Batman and they were always just best friends and real chummy. And Frank Miller was like, well, that's dumb. These two people would not get along.
And what was even more surprising is it ended up being Superman who was the bad guy. Yeah,
Right.
he was authoritarian in a time where, during the Cold War, when authoritarianism was more or less universally seen as bad.
True. But I think that really where a lot of this sort of comes to a head is that I do believe that when you're trying to explore a character, regardless of what allegiance or morality that character may have, that when you're trying to explore that character and do so in a meaningful way, it's hard to do that with somebody that doesn't have any depth, and it's more difficult to do it with a profoundly good character. A common criticism, for example, and we'll use Superman because he's very stereotypical, like the lawful good character. Part
The
of
Boy
the,
Scout.
right. Part of the reason that a lot of modern readers and modern moviegoers think that Superman's so boring is because they're used to seeing something that's very gritty, and the best Superman stories have nothing to do with him facing some kind of challenge he can't own up to. Like, that's not... Superman can do anything. He's basically all-powerful based on the version of the comics you're reading. What makes a great Superman story interesting is when he's faced with some kind of existential moral crisis. What am I going to do? What decision am I going to make? How am I going to handle this? What's the right thing to do? And it's really, really hard to make a good story out of that. It's much easier to make a story about some kind of physical struggle or coming up against an impossible enemy. And so because of that, I think, frankly, and I hate to do this, but partially because of lazy writing, you get a lot more anti-hero characters because it's easier to do something compelling with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big part of it. I don't think that it's exclusively that, but I think that that's a big part of the reason that you're seeing so many more people do something with the anti-heroes.
So you're saying that with the anti-hero type, you can just make the character gritty and grimy and interesting, and then all you have to do for their struggle is just to put them up against some sort of big, bad physical obstacle to overcome. Something that requires more physical strength rather than moral reasoning or something.
I think a really great anti-hero story will include some kind of moral dilemma as well. But yes, I think that you can do that in a way with an anti-hero that you really can't with a stereotypical hero.
I think we did a good job at hashing it out. It's really interesting, especially because comic books in particular are like the modern day mythology, and they really, in the state of literature in general, really reflects on where we are as a society, what is the generally accepted philosophy of the society, how we deal morality and stuff, or how we view morality and stuff like that. And it's just interesting to look at the way it develops from decade to decade and to think about how that reflects on how we view things.
Yeah, I think there's even been a movement, which I think is actually a bad movement, and I think that it's led to some really terrible storytelling. But there's a movement to even de-villainize a lot of the stereotypical villains. Like we see it with Joker.
De-villainize and de-heroize,
Right. And they want to bring
completely
everything...
blur the line. There's no heroes and villains. There's just protagonists and antagonists.
Right, and I think that's largely because of our relativistic view of morals that have cropped up in the past, like our postmodernist thought.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that one thing that Chris brought up, which really interests me, and I hope that this is the case, and I've seen some movement towards this, that there are some people now that are sort of rebelling against that and wanting to get back to something that has objective morality, that has more of that, what we were used to, something that's solid and objective and true, as opposed to everything just being gray and relativistic.
I think it's cyclical. like I think there was a time where the ideal hero was more popular. Obviously, we can look into history and see that.
Sure.
And I think the ideal hero's popularity waned. People got tired of the ideal hero. They ran out of material. And then you saw the rise of the anti-hero. And now I think we may be getting into the territory where the material is starting to run dry on the anti-hero, and anti-heroes are getting overdone. And yeah, I think that may be what happens next. We may be on a cycle where we wind up having ideal heroes again.
Yeah. I think a perfect example is you look at the Spider-Man movies and you look at the first trilogy and then you look at the two with Andrew Garfield and you look at the most recent Spider-Man movies. Which one does Spider-Man most closely resemble an anti-hero? The middle ones, which are by far the worst ones and the ones that people didn't like. And so I think that may be an indication that people are getting a lot more, or warming up a lot more than they would have been a decade ago to the stereotypical lawful good kind of hero. Anyway, all right, guys, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. It's given me some stuff to go home and chew on, to sort of mull over. But I think that it's been really good. Thanks for being with us tonight. So that's going to be our show. We appreciate it. Be back with us next Friday for another edition of The Geekend. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.